Hello everybody and welcome to Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today I'm here with Joe and we're going to be discussing the expanded format in today's video. It's going to be similar to the standard format video that we did a couple of weeks back. Similar style, just talking about what's good in expanded, what you can expect to see and what you should be testing against over the next few weeks. A lot of our tournaments coming up in the UK are going to be expanded, so this is definitely going to be useful for I think both the UK players and the US players, because obviously the cities over in the US, much like our cities over here, is a mixture of standard and expanded. And because we've got some of their results so far, there are a couple of things we can base what we've got to talk about today off. But we've also sort of thrown in our opinions, and everyone knows kind of what's good in expanded anyway. So we're just going to talk about sort of the main decks in expanded and what you can expect to see. So Joe, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, so I think one of the best decks in Expanded right now is actually the Vengeance deck. This is a combination of Vespiquen and Flareon. They share the same attack, where you do 20 plus 10 for each Pokemon in your discard pile. Obviously, we have the Battle Compressor engine, so that gives you a lot of speed, gives you ridiculous consistency as well, because then you have VS Seekers to grab whatever supporters that you want. You're all non-EXs and you're swinging for good damage very early on in the game. So the way you're trying to win is just basically the oldest trick in the book, just good old prize trade. You're all non-EXs. You can use DCs each turn, and you also have the Blacksmith combination with your Flareon pieces that allows you to not only get extra attachments, so that you're not as reliant on double colorless, but it also gives you an out to Giratina, which can also be a problem for the deck. But with a thick enough Flareon line, you should be able to have a Vengeance attacker every single turn that keeps you ticking along and basically aiming to take a prize or two each turn as well. Yeah, it's pretty much just your good old standard beatdown deck. You have to worry about being any type of evolution at all in Expanded, because there is the fear of Archeops. But the Flareon Vespiquen has a few outs to it. I mean, the Eevee itself can evolve out through attaching energy, so that gets around Archeops. And also we have things like Evo Soda. Some can even play Wobbuffet with float stones, because you don't mind just discarding Wobbuffet to fuel your attacks. So there's a few ways that you can play around these different things that Expanded has to offer, but in essence it's just a good non-EX beatdown deck.
Yeah, I think Vespiquen, the Vengeance style, I guess the whole thing is really strong. It's been pretty decent in standard over the past few weeks, and it's always been good. When Flareon was first released, it was always on the fringes until it got really quite popular, sort of the year after it was released. So I think the Vespiquen Flareon sort of whole concept is a really good pick for standard at the moment, because it can tackle EX decks and win the prize trade naturally, and it can tackle non-EX decks, because you really don't need to discard all that many resources to be able to knock out some of these non-EX Pokemon, and then so you've still got a lot of resources to carry on through the game and not sort of run yourself dry. So I think Vengeance on the whole is in a really good place in the format at the moment. Joe mentioned Tina a minute ago, so I'm going to hop into Toad Tina. Toad Tina is still a thing in Expanded, despite Jirachi now being out, because we have lasers to get through the Jirachi sort of other lock, which will get rid of your energy. We have the lasers which can still damage the Jirachi, which means even if you're not doing any damage, you can still Quaking Punch and lock them in the active position. Even better if they're asleep, so they can't attack you again next turn. There's more ways to get around Jirachi. Jirachi is a big reason why Toad Tina isn't all that great in standard at the moment, but I think there's more ways to deal with it in Expanded, so you don't need to be as worried about it. It's obviously still a bit of an issue, and sometimes if they drop the Jirachi on the right turn and you just can't find the resources, that can sort of trip you up for the rest of the game, but there's more ways to deal with it in Expanded. Toad Tina on the whole is just always the same as it always has been, disruptive, and it can win games alone on that. If you disrupt enough, your opponent can't keep up and can't sort of secure a decent prize trade against you. Even though Toad isn't doing all that much damage, he's then got lasers back in Expanded, which means his damage is at least really competitive. the item lock is really useful, and like I say, the disruption itself can just secure games. It is kind of weak to Archiestoise, which we'll be talking about in a bit, but I think depending on how much Archiestoise is around, if you pick the right week, and you think there aren't going to be very many Archiestoise, you could do really well with Totina, just as we've seen in Standard in the UK for the past few weeks, up until Breakthrough's released. I think Totina can really disrupt its way through into the top cut, and once you get to the top cut, if you know how to play certain matchups, you should be fine pretty much going into the top cut, because you know you're going to be facing pretty standard stuff from there on out, really.
Yeah, I still quite like Totina. I think the lasers are just so huge. Toad becomes a threat like on his own now, which is really awesome. And obviously Giratina, it's not like there's many Megas in Expanded right now. I guess you might run into the odd Mega Manectric or the Mega Ray. It's more about his actual attack that's more disruptive. Chaos Wheel making it more difficult for Vespiquen players to attack you, forcing blacksmiths and stuff like that. And also Night March as well. Just that Chaos Wheel can sometimes just lock them completely out of the game, especially if you can catch her up their lone Bronzong, or sometimes they're just playing the Mew or something like that. So once you play around those, the Chaos Wheel should be online for most of the game. So I think Totina is really good. We know disruption is huge. You have lasers back to have, like you were saying, competitive output once again. So I think it's a pretty strong pick. As long as if you do face Archiestoise, they miss turn one, it can be pretty good, because then you are locked down with punches for the rest of the game pretty much. So it's one of these things. Archiestoise normally like hits, I don't know, like 80%, something like that. So it's not very good. But some Toad decks, once if they do miss or whatever, even if they don't get the one shot on the initial turn and you start getting those punches going, those lasers to get locked down, it can be kind of awkward for them. So yeah, Totina I think is a strong play. So we've just been talking a lot about Archiestoise, so we may as well jump to that one as the next deck. It's just the world's winning deck, basically. It's really not too changed from the new cards that we've seen. I think Fisherman would be like the only new inclusion to the deck, which is actually a pretty big inclusion. It helps you out a lot against stuff like Toad, Tina, Toad Bats, Toad Garb, all these things. Fisherman gives you an out to get your energy back, which is pretty big. And then, it's just turn one, you get the Stoice down, you get a bunch of energy on your Keldeos, ideally, so that you can start one-hitting all EXs, which is, the way to win prize trade really against these EX decks, because not many things can just as easily kill a Keldeo, which is pretty cool. And then you have all these techie other attackers like Articuno, and like stuff like Kyurem, the Plasma Kyurem, these sorts of things to help you out against the non-EX matchups. Plasma Kyurem can snipe around the board to maybe kill multiple Night Marchers or set up stuff like Combis. We also have, like I was saying, the Articuno to take multiple prizes with his Delta trait, I think it's called. So it has a lot of options as long as you can get that combo going. I think we know how to build the deck now. We can get it to be a good, consistent enough 80%-ish turn one Archie. So yeah, it's pretty damn strong, even though there is Hex Maniac and stuff now. Hex actually isn't the biggest deal for the deck. As long as Keldeo stays alive the turn that they Hex, it's not that big of a deal. They have to both have the kill and the Hex Maniac all in one turn. And there's very few decks that can get that combination going in the right way to actually do that against you. So a lot of people were saying Archiestoise would die just to Hex. I think dedicated Hex decks, like maybe Hex Night March, something we've seen a lot in the UK, that's quite important, because you can do it on the first turn and stop them getting stuff like Jirachi and Shaman EXs down to get into their combo pieces. But once the actual Blastoise hits play, the Hex isn't as big as you might think. So it's an interesting one. I just think it's a lot of raw power again, a lot of turn one potential, and you can get KOs out of nowhere. So very strong pick again.
Yeah, I think the other thing with Archiestoise is now, like you say, we've got it down to an 80% sort of success rate on the first turn. Pretty much every list you find out there, if it's got that kind of consistency to it, is going to be a good list. So it is something you could pick up and just adapt one or two cards to, and then have a semi-decent list all already, which I think is a really sort of good thing, especially going into Expanded, which may seem daunting to some people after playing Standard for a little while. Knowing that there are good lists out there, I think Archie Stoice is a brilliant place to start. Moving on into Night March, there are kind of two ways you could play Night March in Expanded. There's the Archeops Mew kind of Night March with Maxi and stuff, but I think personally I'm kind of just going to brush over that because I think the Hex March that Joe was just talking about is the far superior build at the moment. I think just it doing so well even in Standard over the past few weeks in the UK has proved how good Hex March can be. It's just so consistent. There is very little you need to change between Standard and Expanded. It's literally like 2 or 3 cards, and you've pretty much got the list built. The biggest thing is computer search. Having another out to your DCE turn 1 is really, really useful. But another out to the Hexes turn 1 is really useful. Computer search just makes the deck tick over even better. I think Hex March could definitely see a lot of play in Expanded, the same as it has done in Standard. I don't really feel like there's all that much to say about Night March, just because everyone knows how powerful it is, everyone knows how quick it is, and everyone knows it can deal with pretty much anything that it comes up against. As long as it gets a semi-decent turn 1 and 2, it pretty much rolls from there.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Hex March, it's been doing really well in Standard over here in the UK. It's basically shifted our metagame on its own shoulders. It's forced everyone to be playing. Almost everyone's playing bat builds now just because of how strong Hex is. You need to have a good Hex matchup, otherwise you won't do well in the tournament. So, and one of the best things that you actually see as we list through these first 3 decks, bats aren't in sight. You're not going to face any bats, so you don't have to worry about that. If bats are coming back, I think it's kind of harsh to brush over the Archeops build. You sort of need that to keep bats in check, and it also really helps out against Vespiquen and Flareon, of course. So if you're more worried about Vespiquen and Flareon, I think you're best playing the Archeops Maxi build. If you're more worried about stuff like Archie Stoice, that's when you want to play the Hex build. So I think different things for different meta games and matchups. I think just because we have such a powerful core for Night March, it's really pretty good. An interesting take is actually whether you play Mew EX or not. We've seen how well Night March has thrived without Mew at all. It'll be interesting to see if people just go for the full non-EX based deck, and the only EXs being stuff like Shamans. That would be quite interesting to me, because people are finding that we can use things like Milotic or Bronzong, or even some people are playing Blacksmith with like non-EX Combat Blaze Entei and stuff like that. People are finding ways around not playing Mew. It'd be interesting to see if people revert back to the Mew or play mainly non-EX decks. I feel there's pros and cons to both. It's going to be one to play around with, but Night March overall, we know consistent builds, like I said. So it's another good place to start, and it can just pretty much prize race its way into a bunch of wins, really.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about probably the last big contender, I would say, and that's going to be Yveltal builds. The main way we see sort of dark variants, Yveltal variants at the moment in Expanded is with, again, it's going to be a maxi combo type thing. A lot of people were playing it with Archeops. Now we have the new option of Gallade as well to add to the mix. Gallade is doing really, really nicely in Standard. The last 2 regionals, it's been 1 in the UK at the very least. And it just shows the power of Gallade, both as an attacker and as a huge consistency booster with that Premonition. It really sorts your deck out so nicely that you can get pretty much, you don't miss a beat as soon as you get that Gallade down. It's really, really nice. So I think a really nice way of playing Yveltal is having a combination of 1 Archeops and 1 Gallade in your list. I think it's one that either myself or Jack will be profiling later on this week, or maybe even into next week, pretty soon at least, because we have been nailing out a list quite nicely. And basically, in the matchups that you need Archeops, you get out Archeops. In the matchups that you need, or you don't need Archeops, you have the luxury of Gallade, which is really awesome. So Yveltal's good. We have the non-EX Yveltal to keep pressure on Night Marchers. We have Yveltal EX, and of course we have Dark Patch, so we can try and at least trade blows with Keldeo EXs, because normally I think they're committing 6 energy, or at least 5 on a muscle band. So if you're having these Dark Patches, you can respond KO with your own Yveltal EXs thanks to Dark Patches. So the trade is kind of there. It's just whether you can start hitting these other type supporters like Lysandering stuff up to keep ahead in prize trade, or if you can hit that Hex on the turn that you can kill a Keldeo. These sorts of things are going to be the ones that swing certain matchups. A kind of awkward matchup is actually Vespiquen and Flareon. Although you do hit nice numbers with stuff like Wise Cyclone and like Retain Energy, just being an EX as your predominant attacker is a bit of an issue. We do have Gallade to try and swing that back in our favor a little bit, but overall you're going to be forced into a situation where at some point you're using an EX against a non-EX. So that's sort of a thing you have to think about. It could even be a case of adding the Zoroark in, making it pretty much identical to a standard build, but you're basically squeezing out spaces to make room for Dark Patch. So again, it's one of these decks that we've seen in the past. We've seen Expanded for a bit now, so everyone's got good lists. That's what I really like about Expanded. We always have good starting points. Like in Standard, it's been up in the air for a little bit. People have been ironing out lists. We just know what's good in Expanded, so everyone's got a great starting point. So it really does make it pretty good for pretty much everyone to play decent decks.
Yeah, I think, like you say, the past 2 weeks, again, whilst it's Standard, I think the fact that Yveltal Zoroark Gallade, Yveltal Gallade has won the past two regionals, I think that in itself has sort of justified its place on this list. Even though it's a completely different format, that deck is strong no matter what format it is. Like you say, Joe, Gallade is such a powerful consistency card. Its attack isn't even that bad either. Yveltal has always been good. It's just sort of reclined a little bit as the format's moved on, but now it's got a decent partner again. It's just in the exact same form that it was like a year or two ago. I think Yveltal is in a really, really good place at the moment, and I think it can really do well against sort of like you said, even though Vespiquen and Flareon is sometimes a bit dicey, it can still pull out wins against that deck. I think it's sort of got really nice matchups across the board. I feel like that's something Yveltal has always been able to say. It's always had semi-favourable matchups across the board, pretty much 50-50s everywhere, with some even better matchups.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're the sort of 5 big ones, but we've got a few more listed down just if you're feeling a little bit adventurous. All of these are, again, still pretty good in our opinion. The first is going to be Dragon Metal. I think Dragon Metal is something that some people haven't really tried, and I think it's definitely worth trying, even if it turns out you don't like the deck. I think Tyrantrum is a surprisingly underrated card. I think some people still don't see its value, and I think it's a really good card. And then you've got Tina, which is, like we've already said today, is just disruptive, and that disruption alone, whilst like we've said, there isn't many megas, Tina can lock down games really, really easily, especially against things like Night March. It can just lock the game down to the point where you're going to win. So I think the Dragon Metal deck definitely has a lot of options. It is pretty weak to Archiestoise, because Archiestoise sort of does what Dragon Metal does, but it does it on turn 1 with a massive Keldeo to deal with whatever EX you've got, and if not, they've got other sort of smaller attackers to deal with the Bronzongs or whatever you sort of throw at them. I think the Archiestoise matchup can be a bit dicey, but provided there's not many Archiestoise and there's not too many Archeops around, because obviously that will stop your Bronzongs, I think Dragon Metal is a semi-decent play. After playing the deck a little bit, I really enjoy playing the deck. I just know it might not be the perfect time for it just yet, until we know exactly where Archie and Archeops exactly are in the format, but it's definitely a really fun one to try.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think it thrives in a metagame based more around Vespiquen and Night March than, like you were saying. Archiestoise is just a really difficult matchup because they take the initiative and it's almost impossible for you to take that back. Like Tyrantrum, yeah, it can trade the KOs, but you've probably already lost a prize or two setting up your own board state to the point where you can get these consistent Tyrantrums out. So it doesn't like the Archiestoise, so it's kind of slow. But against these things like Night March and Vespiquen, where you get the Chaos Wheels going, you have enough time in that matchup to recover and win back the prize race to eventually win games. So it seems pretty nice. We know how good Bronzong is. There's plenty of attackers for it. So, yeah, it's still got a place in the game, I think. Next up, we're going to talk about a different Toad variant. This is going to be Toad Bats. Toad Bats, it pretty much functions in a similar vein as Toadina. You just, instead of leaving the Quaking Punch, the safety of a Quaking Punch, you just have the Bats instead, we were saying how for the Toadina matchups against stuff like Vespiquen and Night March, you sort of move into the Chaos Wheel to try and lock down the game. With Toad Bats, it's different. You're trying to take the prizes through the bat drops to get multiple prizes against the non-EX decks, whilst keeping that disruption as high as possible. We of course have laser, so our output does start getting pretty high pretty quickly. If we time it nicely with the bats, the maths can be really nice, so that you get them dying back into your turn thanks to poison, stuff like this. You can manipulate quite nicely to get extreme value out of these lasers and stuff like that. So you're just pushing Toad's output that much higher each time, whilst having this additional disruption factor. And another pretty interesting point is you actually have non-EXs in the deck, so that against stuff like Archie you have some sacrificial lambs to buy you a few turns, because against Archie as well, it's one of these things that can just start rolling. And if you're just playing a full EX deck like Toadina, they're going to win in 3 turns if you don't stop them. And Toad Bats buys you slightly more time, which is a nice little thing to have, I think, against that deck specifically, because then you can get a heads flip on a laser. Obviously, if you're using Quaking Punch, it's harder for them to find their second Keldeo and stuff like that. So it can actually work in your favor a little bit. So I think Toad Bats has the tools to deal with stuff just because it has that extra output, and Quaking Punch is so disruptive. So I think it's always going to be a decent contender.
Yeah, I think it's again it's going to be a little bit of a format decision depending on what you're going to see. You're either going to go for Bats or not Garbodor, Giratina, and that's or Garv, and that's going to depend on sort of what you pair Toad with, depending on what you think you're going to see on the day, because they both have strengths and weaknesses, and in the right format, both I think can do really well. The next sort of one we're going to talk about is actually another disruption deck, and it's going to be Sableye Garbodor. This is a little... I love this deck. I think this deck is brilliant. I've started playing with it today, and I think it's brilliant. It's so trolly. It's you do have a really weak Vespiquen and Flareon matchup. I'm not going to sit here and say it's really underrated. Your Vespiquen and Flareon matchup is usually a loss, simply because the whole idea of Sableye Garbodor is getting rid of all of their energy, chaining life dews to the point where they deck out. Well, whilst the Sableye Flareon player the Vespiquen Flareon player, will get rid of so much of their deck to be able to one-shot you with the Vengeance. They can chain Blacksmiths, which is 2 more energy you have to deal with each turn. And that's just sort of the complete opposite of what the deck wants to deal with. The deck is designed to get rid of energy when they're attaching 2 from a Blacksmith that aren't specials, and then have an extra attachment each turn. They're often going to have more energy than you can deal with, even with junk hunting back all of your sort of little energy toys. They'll often be able to have 1 more energy than they need for them to be able to chain KOs, even if you can get the life dews. It gets to the point where they can sort of chain enough KOs that it doesn't matter how many life dews you're going to get, because eventually you will run out of resources. Especially with N as well. N is something that can really put the deck sort of back a peg, but not really bother the Flareon Vespiquen player, because their board setup is based in their discard rather than their hand. So if you can end them, get rid of some of their cards, they can still do well. That being said, if you can cycle life dew, you can deck people out pretty easily. People kind of want to go ham to try and deal with this board state because they don't want to be trolled, and they end up sort of shooting themselves in the foot. It's a bit like... It feels a little bit like the Toadina mirror sometimes. They just play too many cards to be able to have enough cards to stop you by the time they run out of cards. They can't take 6 prizes if you can cycle life dew, if they start sycamoring every turn just to get more and more sort of things to try and slow you down, to the point where the Sableye Garbodor can lose 5 prizes and still win the game just because your opponent's got rid of all of their resources. Life dew is obviously a really good A-spec in this deck. Being able to chain it is a lot of fun, and it can be really annoying for your opponent. So if you don't want to deal with people complaining all day, perhaps don't play this. But I've started to play it a little bit today, and I really, really like this deck. I think it's a lot of fun to play.
Yeah, other than Vespiquen and Flareon, it has the answers for every deck, basically. As long as you know going into the matchup, like, how you're going to negotiate it, I think you can have a good time. Kind of awkward against the Toad decks. It's almost like a slow grind against Toad, because you need to start finding your Zerosic and your high counts of Flare Grunts like early on in the game to have a good chance, because sometimes you just play so many trainers in that deck that sometimes you can just get, Quaking Punch out of the game in the first place. But as long as you can find these Troll supporter cards early enough in the game to where you get all the energy out of the Toad's deck, then you just win. So I think it's crucial to have a high supporter disruption count in terms of Zerosic and Flare Grunt, whereas other things in the deck you can get away with having a one of, because then you junk hunt it back to recover the Troll cards. So if it's something like a random target whistle or something like that, so that you have extra Lysander targets, why not? You have the space in that deck, just because you can play so many one-offs and then catch people off guard with these crazy things that you thought, wow, why on earth is he playing that card? Oh, okay, now I'm stuck in the active position and he's going to do this every single turn. Oh, great, okay, that's a really difficult thing to get around. So Sableye Garb, it can just really put people on edge, on tilt, and as like Vespiquen and Flareon, the reason why it's really good in the matchup is because, like you said, the energy comes back. It doesn't really need much from hand and stuff, so you can't hand disrupt them with like judges or ends too much, really. Like, you can buy yourself a turn or two, but that's really about it. And also they have like the Flareon's what's going to be attacking, and then Vespiquen has free retreat, so there's not even any Lysander targets to like slow them down at all. But every other deck in format has that. Like Archie Stoice, you just bring up the Blastoise, and also you've got Garbodor, so they can't rush in out of there. So all of these things can be really nice. Yeah, I think it's a pretty good deck overall. Next up, let's talk about Donphan. Donphan's quite an interesting pick. Most people are having to play it with Wobbuffet. This is twofold, really, because of Archeops is one reason, so that you can actually evolve into Donphan. Pretty important, I would say, as your main attacker. But also, obviously, it's Archie Stoice. You want to have the ability locked down to slow people. In general as well, you're stopping Shaman and stuff like that. So slowing people down enough so that Donphan can get rolling. That was a pun intended. But like you do have like focus sashes to make it really annoying, and obviously Robosub is going to be one of your go-to picks as well, to win matchups against stuff like Night March and Vespiquen and Flareon, which is pretty interesting. That's a really good pick for those two decks if you feel like those are going to be in a high concentration. As long as Wobbuffet's in play, you can slow down Keldeo Stoice quite a bit, to the point where you're taking multiple KOs. You have to worry about the Articuno in that matchup. I think it's important to play the Magnetic Storm Stadium, I think it is, that stops resistance. I think it's important to play two of those and like a 2-2 split of your stadiums, so that you can actually do damage to that Articuno. Most Keldeo Stoices only play 1 or 2 stadium of the Rough Seas, but it's still hard enough trying to get through an Articuno just with that resistance alone. So having that stadium is important in those matchups. It actually really helps you against like baby Yveltals as well. These sorts of annoying non-EXs are the things that actually can really take down a Donphan player, because they can break sashes, and if it is the Keldeo Stoice player, they can take multiple prizes on the Donphan once they do catch her up. So I think it's interesting. It lacks a bit of power. It takes these sort of 1-2 shots. It really doesn't appreciate Toad matchups because you can't develop a lot of your board state, but you do have Horluchas to try and keep you in the game. So it's a way of building your deck consistently whilst having all these disruption factors in here. You've got to have a couple of Focus Sash at least, got to have 3 to 4 Robo, got to have 3 to 4 Wobbuffet, you've got to have probably 2 Horlucha minimal. It's going to be a weird blend to get all of these things shoved in one deck together and still make it consistent. I think that's one of the biggest challenges for Donphan, and probably why it's pretty much more of a rogue aspect right now than it is one of the top tier cards.
Yeah, I definitely agree with pretty much everything you've said there. In the perfect world, it would only need one of its partners, but unfortunately, because of the way the format is at the moment, it needs a little bit of everything. The last sort of big discussion we're going to have is Fighting Bats, because the difference between Fighting Bats in Standard and Expanded is it has Landorus back, which means it's more of a sort of spread deck, putting damage everywhere and taking 3 or 4 prizes in a turn, just through bat damage and then a pretty big Landorus attack. It's good against non-EX decks just for that fact. It can take 3 or 4 prizes in a turn, and
3 or 4?
Yeah, trust me. It can
make it well.
it can really do well against sort of some of the other EX decks with Sash that would usually sort of threaten the one-shot. Though that being said, Yveltal and Archie, if you can't hit your Sashes, they just sort of trounce you. Keldeo especially, because it only needs 3 energy, so that they can just manually attach when they don't even need the Archie, because they can the Archie because they can just manually attach and still one-shot your Landorus pretty quickly. So Archie is kind of a bit iffy, especially as the bats don't do all that much in that matchup either. But one thing to note, I think I've just realised mainly, is that we haven't really talked about any Mega decks so far, and I think that is something that makes Fighting Bats a little bit better, because Megas having 220, 230 HP all of a sudden makes the sort of drops from Fighting Bats a lot less painful. And if the format is really Mega based, then Fighting Bats doesn't sort of get its cheap attacks off anymore. It has to deal with these sort of big HP Pokemon killing them in 3 or 4 chunks when they can usually easily one-shot the Landorus or whatever back. So I think the fact that we haven't actually spoken about any Mega decks so far is something to the advantage of Fighting Bats, just because it hasn't got to deal with these 210 HP monsters every turn that have half-decent attacks that can return KO them really easily as well. I think that's an important sort of positive of Fighting Bats. That being said, I think the Yveltal and Archie matchup are a little bit questionable, and sometimes the fact that they're 2 of the most popular decks out there at the moment, I think would sort of steer me away from Fighting Bats just a little bit, unless there was some overhaul where Archie and Yveltal weren't played at all for a little while, then maybe I would be drawn back into Fighting Bats, because against things like Vespiquen and Flareon, it can do really well, because the EVs are weak, the combis don't have much HP. You can get rid of a few of those sort of turn after turn after turn, and by the point that they've got a half decent setup, yeah, they might have a load of Pokemon in the discard, but you've only got 2 prizes left, so you just need to catch a couple of Pokemon or a Shaman or whatever, and you take the game, which is even easier with the backdrops as well. But yeah, I think the fact that we haven't really talked about any Megas is good. The fact that Archie, and Yveltal are definitely a really big thing in Expanded is not so good for Fighting Bats on the whole.
Yeah, I think it preys on the non-EX decks really, just because low HP and you're hitting the right numbers all around their board. You keep up with prize trades, Sash keeps you in the game. I think against Archie and Yveltal, using like Hawlucha and then focus sashing Hawluchas can keep you up in terms of prize race when they are using Keldeo and Yveltal EX. The issue is when they're not using Yveltal and Keldeo EX, because again, they have the answers. They have this Articuno that most people play at least one of, and the Yveltal deck has non-EX Yveltal, and that's when it's just like we were saying with Donphan. It's really awkward for you to hit these numbers if you're using Lucarios or Landoruses. Even if you can hit through the resistance with Lucario, the attack's base output is not good enough. And obviously, if it is an Archie player, they can then just rush into a Keldeo and take out that big EX that you've tried to attack with. So as long as the Archie player and the Yveltal player know how to play around Fighting Bats, it's pretty easy matchups for them. But that's not always the case. And using Hawluchas with Focus Sashes can sometimes keep you ahead early game, and then you sort of worry about those things late game, or even Lysander round at that point in the game to just win you the game overall. So it prefers the non-EX decks overall, but Hawlucha can keep you in other games. So there's a few other kind of less on the radar picks that we'll go over. Rayquaza's one of them. Rayquaza's actually one deck that I think relishes the Archie matchup. I think this is something we can't really say about many other decks. Maybe the Vespiquen deck, but even then people are teching for that. Not many people are teching for Ray at the moment. And the reason why Ray is quite good against Archie in particular is because you can set up as quickly as Archie and it's easier for you to one-shot Archiestoise in terms of a prize race because you have such a high HP, you're forcing pretty much multiple superior energy retrievals out of them each turn, whereas you're sat there with your Rayquaza and you're just pounding on them because, like I was saying earlier, Archiestoise only has space for 1 or 2 stadiums max. Some people cut them all together, so Rayquaza maintains its board state really easily. We have stuff like Hooper, we have Winona, we have Bridget, we have all these different ways of getting our Pokemon out now. Rayquaza will set up as quickly as an Archiestoise, really. You're not attacking the first turn most of the time, but in terms of getting at least a Mega down just for that HP buff, making you sort of keep in the prize race, I think Rayquaza actually relishes that opportunity. It kind of struggles against Totina. Obviously, the Giratina is going to be an issue. Yveltal's not the hardest of matchups. Again, it's just that big HP, which is really nice, that helps you out. But obviously they can play around you, they can conserve their energy enough to the point where later on they can take the kills. And then the Vespiquen and Flareon is probably that and Night March. Those are the 2 biggest hurdles, I think. It might even be the case where you need to play non-EX Yveltals in your Rayquaza build, which could be quite fun. I think that actually really improves your matchup against Totina as well, because obviously they're going to be hammering you away. But if you just use non-EX Yveltals, maybe even 1 Yveltal EX in your deck, here I am getting all creative right in front of you guys. That could give you a better matchup against Totina overall. But Rayquaza, I feel like it has the answers for Archiestoise, so if that's like the flagship deck, it could be pretty good, but it does sort of struggle against Vespi and Night March, so those are things you pretty much have to consider. So.
Yeah, he's gonna make this like just after this video. He's gonna build it and tell me like for the next week how good this deck is. The next Mega is it's another Mega that I'm going to talk about is Mega Manectric and just Manectric on the whole. Manectric is pretty similar to how it is in Standard. It's really consistent. It does its thing. It gets 2 energy back. It hits okay numbers. It has Rough Seas. It can set up a Regice. I think it's just not quite there at the moment. I think the Night March matchup can be an issue. I think the Vespiquen matchup can be an issue. I think we've seen that over the past 2 weeks over here in the UK, because Vespiquen Yveltal Bats sort of really does pretty well against that deck. And then some of the other matchups are shaky. Rayquaza, if there's Rayquazas around, sure, I'll take them every day. If there's Yveltals around, to be fair, I'll probably take them every day. But now they have Gallade. That's nowhere near as nice as it used to be. You used to take 6 prizes on 3 Yveltals. Now you have to deal with a Gallade that can one-shot your Megas for a DCE, and you can't one-shot back, which can be a real issue. It also gets through the Regice, one-shots the Regice. I think Gallade in itself, just as one card, can sort of put this deck on the back heel a little bit. Just because if they're running 1 or 2 copies of Gallade, they can take 2 to 4 prizes, and your sort of whole thing with Manectric being efficient and taking a lot of prizes for not many energy is sort of countered with a non-EX that is really consistent and hits you for weakness for a DCE and pretty much kills you every turn. I think Gallade is a huge issue for Manectric, and I think that kind of puts it on the back burner a little bit in Expanded, especially as I think there's more opportunities for Gallade in Expanded. I think it's a lot easier to get Maxi and Archie combos, and I think that sort of puts Manectric on the back foot a little bit, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think, Jack, there's one way that you can kill Gallade quite easily for Manectric, in Expanded anyway, and that's if you're playing the Garbodor build by actually having the tool drop Trubbish. I think that's probably one of the best ways we can actually play Manectric.
I'd completely forgotten about tool drop.
Yeah, yeah, that's a thing. We have tool drop Trubbish.
Yeah.
Actually, I think Garbodor is probably the best pair in Expanded, just so that you have a matchup against Archiestoise, and then you have the tool drop Trubbish, and you're playing all these things like Headringer to help you out against Totina. You have, a bunch of tools of your own. Obviously, you're maxing out like Spirit Link counts. You're probably playing 1 or 2 muscle bands so that you can use Overrun on Manectrics to kill stuff like Joltix in 1 hit, and also you can kill Combies in 1 hit. So the math works out a bit nicer if you're playing that build. But even then, it's kind of shaky against the Vespiquen, kind of shaky against the Night March. You really are relying on getting out Garbodor early against Archiestoise. It sometimes is just too slow and doesn't set up at all, because at the end of the day, it is a stage 1 and it is a mega that you're trying to develop almost every game. It's important to develop both of them. But we do have that little old Trubbish to help us out against Yveltal, Gallade. So I think that would be a positive matchup at the very least.
Yeah.
So yeah, Manectric Garb's quite a fun one. And if you play it well enough and can build it consistently to get that mega out each turn, or every game on turn 2, you're going to have a good time, I think, against a lot of things. Let's talk about another kind of roguish cards. We've said the power of Wobbuffet earlier, and now it's going to be as his own attacker. Wobbuffet with bats. One of the best bat builds, I think, around at the moment, just because you're guaranteed to get them out, even against Archeops. This is one of the issues for fighting bats. If someone develops Archeops on you, you've got 7 or so slots out of your deck that's just completely dead now. Obviously, Wobbuffet shuts down Archeops, so we're always getting value out of these bats. Bat drops obviously are helpful against stuff like Vespiquen, stuff like Night March for taking these extra prizes here and there. Wobbuffet has the good typing as well. Against Night March, you can hit against Mews and stuff like that. You have good typing against Gallade, which is actually an attacker now, which is pretty cool. And like you were saying earlier, Jack, there's not many Mega decks around, and Megas was one of the biggest issues for Wobbuffet bats. Wobbat sort of had a little sort of dip of hype early on in its career, but as more and more playable Megas came out, it just sort of faded out of existence, because that's just too much HP to stack up onto something. You commit so many resources to actually get these knockouts. Now that there's quite a few non-EXs, and the EXs that we are playing have normally 170 HP, in like Keldeo and Yveltal are probably the most popular ones, it's quite easy for Wobbuffet to get enough counters on to the... with bat drops, you get enough counters to where Wobbuffet can either 2-shot or 1-shot, with the combination of the bat damage. So I think it can keep up. We have things like Bridget now as well, to make getting 3 Zubat out on turn 1 like a real possibility. And that was one of the issues for the deck, I think. It was kind of slow. Obviously, we don't have Shaman to help us draw into nice hands. But as long as we hit Bridget early on, and then we have a high ball count and a high trainer draw count, maybe even Acrobike, now that Superrod's back with us or whatever. So as long as you can build Wobbats nicely, I think it actually has decent matchups. Obviously, Archiestoise, it's really awkward for them just because of Wobbuffet alone. We have these bat drops against the non-EX decks, and just by being non-EX ourselves, we can keep up in prize trade against stuff like Totina and against stuff like Yveltal. So could be a nice pick there, as long as you can build it consistently.
Yeah, I think Wobbats is a deck that's always... I think its biggest sort of hurdle has been finding a really strong, consistent list, and I think it's one of those decks where if you can find a strong, consistent list, you could really do well at a tournament, because I don't think many people are going to be expecting it at all either, so you're going to surprise a lot of people. Next up is Groudon. I do kind of like Groudon in Expanded. I think it's a little bit of a sleeper. I don't think it's going to do amazingly well, but I think it's a decent pick. We've been talking all day about how passive abilities are so strong. Well, with Groudon, you're sitting behind a Wobbuffet. You can't... things like, trolley decks like Sableye, Garb and Totina can't get rid of your energy. You can knock out EXs consistently turn after turn. I think Groudon's biggest issue is the issue that it's always kind of had is it's really slow. You have to take 4 turns to set up, and whilst your Wobbuffets are stopping things like the Archeops from stopping you evolving and Archiestoise from setting up on the whole, I think we're in a really quick format at the moment, and once you promote the Groudon, Night March can one-shot you relatively easily, providing they have a way to deal with your Focus Sash. Like they can even get rid of they can even hit you with the Focus Sash and then hit you the next turn. There, you're only taking 1 prize to their 2, which I think is a real issue. The same with Vespiquen, plus the Vespiquen has weakness, so it only needs like 10 Pokemon in the discard. So it's a similar issue there. They can take the turn to get rid of your Focus Sash and then hit you the next turn and do a huge chunk of damage. Pretty much always knocking you out as long as they've dealt with the Focus Sash. I think the speed of Groudon, it's probably his biggest weakness. It's a really slow deck that you have to set up, but I think if you set it up, it could do really, really well. I think it's definitely a bit of a sleeper. No one is talking about Groudon at the moment, and I do kind of like Groudon in in Expanded, at least. I'm not at all keen on it in Standard, but I think in Expanded it could do pretty well. I think it's a bit like Wobbats. No one's going to be prepared for it, and if they don't know how to deal with the matchup properly, I think they can sort of watch themselves get swept in 3 turns for 6 prizes.
I think there's a couple of hurdles for Groudon. It obviously hits the right numbers once you get going. Like you were saying, the disruption in terms of item disruption doesn't hurt you. One of the things is, obviously, Giratina is a big problem. One of the reasons why it's not working in Standard right now is there's still quite a bit of play for Tina. It's really difficult for Groudon to play around that, especially because you can't, once you've been hit with Chaos Wheel, you can't put the stadium in play to get the right damage going, so you need to chain a couple of Hex Maniacs just to get over one Giratina. And in Expanded, it's quite easy to chain Giratinas. Like, it's easier than it is in Standard just because we have decks that do the right thing, because we have nice supporters and we have A-specs and all that good stuff, so that's an issue for it. Another issue is just what sort of tool do you want to put on Groudon? There's about 4 picks that I would have on Groudon. Against stuff like Totina, I want to have Assault Vest. Against Vespiquen, you need to have at least like 2 Focus Sash. Same thing for Night March. At times you want to have stuff like Hard Charm, like against Yveltal, because otherwise they can just laser through you. So it looks like you're probably going to have like 3 or 4 different tools just in your deck. And you probably need to have 1 or 2 counts, more of them each. I guess Eco Arm could be a card that you play, but who really wants to do that, you know? No one wants that in their deck. And it's still kind of clunky. You draw at the wrong time. It's almost like Super Odd, where there'll be games where you just Sycamore it away because you had it at the wrong time. So just building Groudon alone is a headache, I think. So there's just better decks out there right now, because you're trying to cover such a vast field that you're going to get tripped up by something if you play, X amount of tools of one thing and not enough of the other. So it does have the power and the potential, but there's just so many things that it has to cover all at once that it's going to be tricky to do that.
Yeah, true.
The next thing we'll talk about is Mewtwo. It's been somehow blowing up on Verbank that Mewtwo is now a good deck in Expanded, or sometimes I think there's been some Standard decks even where people have tried it out. I personally just think it's a worse Yveltal, but there's plenty of reasons why I could be disproven here. Mewtwo's attack is much more powerful, of course, and we also have the old Mewtwo. We have X-Ball back in Expanded, so just having X-Ball alone keeps you in games against Archie is really good against Toad and Tina, because you trade quite nicely just for DCE. You have attackers each turn to deal with stuff like Night March and Vespiquen. I personally feel like to help swing those matchups, just because you are mainly an EX, if you use the Mewtwo, I think, again, going back to my good buddy non-EX Yveltal, I think that's a great way of charging up Mewtwo in the first place. And I think that keeps you in games against stuff like Night March and Vespiquen, almost to the point where you don't develop Mewtwo at all, really. But then in these other games, we do have this EX, even the Mega, and we were saying how Rayquaza and Manectric, if you get them set up against stuff like Yveltal, and even to an extent, I guess you could say Archie, it has that higher echelon of HP where it just becomes that bit more difficult for them to get knockouts. They either have to overextend, or sometimes they don't even get the knockout. And when you're not doing that, and then the Mewtwo obviously will be getting KOs because the Mega Mewtwo's attack is furious. Obviously, it preys on Yveltal and Keldeo, like those were its favourite things to deal with. So it's going to be getting knockouts in those matchups. So I can see where it will work. The only thing is, it's clunkier. It's just a way clunkier. It's like a greedy Yveltal, I guess, where you get more benefit once you finally get him set up, but you have to go through the headache of actually setting him up. So what are your thoughts on Mewtwo?
It's something I really want to try, but I can, just looking at the list, there's so many sort of places where I could go, well, you could just put 3 Yveltal in there and save yourself 5 slots. And
Yeah.
at that point, you're like, why aren't you doing that? Why are you not just playing Yveltal? So I can definitely see the sort of how it's a worse Yveltal, but I think the fact that it's been doing okay over there, I think it makes me want to try it just to see what all the hype is about. Obviously, like you say, the numbers are a little bit nicer, but I think Yveltal's numbers are fine, especially fine enough just to run that instead of Mewtwo. I can see it being a clunky Mewtwo, but it is, I think it's intriguing more than anything, just to see how similar and how different the matchups are, or the decks themselves are. but there's definitely a lot of similarities. Sort of just looking at the decks, there's a lot of similarities between them. The last deck, I think it's the last deck we're going to talk about is.
I've got one as well.
Oh, okay. The last deck I'm going to talk about is Aselgor. Aselgor is something that has always haunted the word expander just because of how scary auto paralysis is. This is nowhere near as much of an issue as it used to be because everyone remembered Archeops was a thing, and if you can chain hexes then fine, but Archeops is such sort of a real hurdle for the deck because they're doing nothing. They're doing nothing to detriment themselves, whereas your whole strategy is based on either finding a Mew and being able to do it that way, or evolving an Aselgor each turn. So if they can get around you having Mews obviously, unless you drop them on the same turn, they're pretty much catch a target, so you have to hold them until you're going to use them. If they Archie turn 1, if they Archeops turn 1, you really have to struggle to get the Aselgor down, and then you have to wait a turn to then be able to use the Mew because you can't use its ability to use the attack. So I think Archeops, just as a card, puts the whole deck sort of in check so much that I don't really rate it too much as a pick at the moment. Obviously, auto paralysis is a really, really scary thought, and no one has ever really liked auto paralysis, but I think Archeops is a real big issue for the deck.
I kind of agree, but I feel like Aselgor has to adapt for expanded. I think you don't play like Aselgor Trev anymore. You play a more of a soft lock approach where you just play it with Wobbuffet, just like Donphan really, where you're going to go into Wob so that Archistoise can't rush in around your paralysis, and also you then are obviously allowed to evolve as well. Through Archeops. The only issue of having a soft lock now is obviously it's easier to get around. People just playing Switch, people playing AZ, and then just Lysandering and killing your Aselgor. It puts a lot of pressure on you to keep finding it each turn. So I think not necessarily. Well, yes, I agree that Archeops and like Keldeo are the biggest issues. It just forces your list to be different to then have different weaknesses, if that makes sense. So whereas Trevor was more of a hard lock, you will be stuck here. I'll just catch her up your Keldeo with that float stone and it'll be stuck there because I have Trevor and stuff. Obviously, Archistoise normally plays multiple Keldeo, so they can get around it anyway, unless you play Wob. But by playing Wob, it means that you don't have that hard lock that the deck really sort of needs, I think, to do well.
Yeah.
So the last deck that I want to discuss at least is Raichu Bats. It's another deck that really is hurt by Archeops. But really, out of the top 5 decks, some Night Marchers will play it, some won't. Some Yveltal players will play it. If people are getting greedy with Gallade, like from mirror matches and stuff like that, you've got to feel like Gallade is the superior build. Why would you want to get Archeops out in the first place against decks like that? So out of the 5 decks, only 1 or 2 of them are going to even play Archeops in the first place. So if you really feel like you're not going to be facing Archeops, Raichu Bats is still a really strong pick. It's a very similar thing in the means of Rayquaza. Against Archistoise, you're going to keep your board state out. You're going to have enough bench Pokemon to where Raichu is either getting a one-shot with Muscle Band or with extra bat drops. So that's pretty good. Obviously, you're non-EX, so you have that prize trade option available. And also just having these bats means that against Night March, if they're not playing Archeops, and against Vespiquen, you should have good prize trade there. You don't even need like full benches to get the knockouts, and then you just have the additional bat snipes. So you have decent matchups around the board. Obviously, an issue is when your stadium gets replaced. Like, Totina is quite difficult for you because your output isn't really good enough without the stadium. And once you start getting hit with Chaos Wheel, not only can you not replace the stadium for good output, but you can't put DC into play, so you can't really attack very well either. Most of the time, you need to have at least a 1-1 or 2-2 Bronzong. So there's definitely hiccups for Raichu Bats, but it is pretty much the most aggressive in terms of prize trade once you start getting your board state going. It's a non-EX that can extend into one-shot range, just like a Vespiquen, but then you also have bat drops to deal with, mirror matches or Vespiquen or Night March. So in terms of non-EX decks, it's probably the most aggressive prize trade rise in terms of raw thing. Just once you get that board state going, you have the most raw potential there for prize trade. It's just that can sort of be dismantled by getting rid of the stadium or Archeops and stuff like that. So there's definitely hurdles for Raichu.
Yeah, I think Raichu sort of dropped off the radar a little bit, and I think it's definitely one that could do it really, really well. All the past sort of 7 or 8 decks we talked about are things people aren't going to have the time to test against. If they're going to want strong matchups against the top 5 or 6 decks, they're not going to have time to test against some of these, which means that you're not going to go into a matchup where they're going to know exactly what to do from turn 1. They might have to spend 2 or 3 turns properly thinking about how am I going to win this game. And by then, especially with things like Raichu Bats, you can really storm ahead because it can act like a really aggressive EX deck, but it's a non-EX, and it's got bonus damage from bat drops, and it's pretty consistent in itself just because it's not bothered by a lot of different things that some other decks are. So I think Raichu Bats is definitely a real nice pick. I think it's sort of, again, a little bit of a sleeper that no one is really thinking of. Everyone's just presuming, oh, Archeops is about, so this deck won't work. Well, if you look at the top 5, only two or three variants that we can see actually play Archeops, and at that point, you have to consider whether it's going to have pretty much good matchups throughout the day. So I think the last thing for us to talk about is what our picks are. And I'm going to go ahead. Whilst I really want to say Sableye Garbodor, I'm actually going to go with Yveltal, Archeops, Gallade, or some form of the 3. I think we've been talking how disruptive Archeops is pretty much all video. Archeops has really shaped the expanded format. I think Joe has emphasised how good Gallade is. Gallade is a really, really strong card, and like we said, in the games where you have the luxury of getting it out, you have so much more consistency than your opponent, to the point where you can often do really well just because you've got a Gallade and they don't. I think its matchups are pretty okay across the board. I think if you can secure the Archeops when you need to, you can do really well in that matchup. If you don't need the Archeops, then you've got the luxury of Gallade. Yveltal is back, and I think I think Expanded is the real place for Yveltal to shine this year.
Yeah, I agree. If you hadn't picked it, it would have been my pick, so I guess I'll go for a different one. I'll say Vespiquen and Flareon, just because it's in terms of speed, it's up there with Night March. I think you have to concede the fact that Night March is a little bit quicker, but it just has more options than the Night March deck. You have Blacksmith to get you out of binds up against Giratina, and up against stuff like Sableye Garb or Toad if they're using loads of energy disruption. So it just has this just more answers than Night March, but with almost as much pace. And you're just going to win on prize trade against a whole different thing, a whole different bunch of decks on that fact alone. So I think you have to write that as one of the top decks to pick.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's our expanded chat for the next sort of 5 or 6 weeks going into the end of December and early January and February. There's a lot of expanded tournaments over here. Pretty much, we've got a few standard and expanded cities over the next 2 months, and then it's pretty much expanded on until nationals for us, bar the ECC. So you can definitely expect a bit more expanded on the channel for at least the next 2 or 3 months, just because that's going to be the majority of what we're playing. We are still going to be delving into standard, and obviously we've got a new set coming in the next couple of months, so things are going to change with standard too. But I think we're going to be a little bit more focused on expanded for the next little while, so you can expect a few more expanded deck analysis videos over the next coming weeks. That's pretty much all I've got to say. Is there anything left for you to say, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a lot of these expanded decks already on the channel, but obviously with the new set and the formats being slightly shifting now and again, we might be updating ones that you've already seen, but we will also be coming out with new ones here and there as well. Gallade is one that we're going to try and get out quite quickly, because that's one that's really sort of developed a lot more quickly than all the other ones have. So overall, yeah, that's it from me as well.
Okie doke. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it from both of us. So thank you very much for watching. I still haven't worked out a way to find out how long these videos are, so it's probably another really long discussion video. But hey, who doesn't like to listen to all of our fantastic opinions? Thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack from Omnipoke with Joe, and we will see you in another video.